Thanks very much, Sean. It's been such a pleasure, as I was saying in this morning's discussion, it's been such a pleasure learning to get to know all of my drug policy colleagues over the years. You guys have been my pillars of strength when it comes to the bigger picture. It's sometimes very difficult to translate the bigger picture of drug policy through to the cannabis community on the ground. As Simon was saying, in September 2018, we got the Constitutional Court confirmation of the Western Cape judgment by Judge Davis that the continued prohibition of the personal use of cannabis within private spaces was unconstitutional. Now, the South African Constitutional Court judgment on that fateful day was both the best and the worst judgment, both at the same time. On an international level and in terms of how things are developing in cannabis legislative reform, we were the first country to put privacy first. That means putting people first, doesn't it? Our privacy is a human right. The prohibition of the use and cultivation for personal use within private places was declared unconstitutional, and certainly our Constitution protects our human rights. But, no trade. And this is when we come to the topic of our conversation today. Be careful what you wish for. Or as the lawyers would say, the law of unintended consequences. Now, with this privacy judgment, didn't we get what we wanted? Didn't we get our human rights? The trade in cannabis is in a free fall in South Africa, as Charity was telling us earlier. Many legacy operators, indigenous people and local communities have been left behind since the judgment. Those with the means to exploit the glaring lack of legislative change have done so in the last 5 years. The farmers in Pondoland hadn't sold any of their crops for the last 2 years. The recent Pakisa Action Lab, we sat together with the government day and night for 5 days outside Pretoria. It achieved little by way of resolving this huge issue that has to do with our rural farmers and our township carcinomic economy. The same is happening in other countries in Africa. Medical cannabis licenses are being granted for export, but the citizens are still being arrested in the street. Yes, Ghana, yes, Zimbabwe, and yes, a whole lot of other countries in Africa. Because what this is the neo-colonial capture of our cannabis. Because how can you be giving somebody a license to grow and export cannabis and then you arrest your citizens in the street? How can you be producing medical cannabis, which I always use in inverted commas, I prefer to say cannabis for health uses, while you are not introducing a program of cannabis for children with epilepsy in your basic health programs? What is that about, Africa? You should be ashamed of yourself. They're capturing your cannabis. How can you be doing this? This is something that really, really frustrates me with the rest of Africa. In a very ironic way, Fields of Green for All continues to fight for all in capital letters, including those who are making loads of money from cannabis. Of course, everybody wants it to be legal. But then even more ironic than that is that Fields of Green for All is the only cannabis relegalization non-profit company in South Africa, and we are the only non-profit company only dealing in cannabis who has ECOSOC status at the United Nations. So we are concentrated on cannabis. I use broader drug policy for my support and because I find it academically really interesting and because we have to be able to see the bigger picture in all of this. But I'm literally all about cannabis. And as my dear departed Jules always used to say, I'm not sick, I don't want to make socks, I just want to get high. So you know? But ladies and gentlemen, all is not what it seems under the dacha tree, because it's not. We have this disparity. At the top, we have our cognitive liberty, which is a primal human right. At the bottom, we have this thing called stigma. How many times have we heard this word, stigma, stigma, stigma? So with the African countries who are granting these medical cannabis licenses, are you not stigmatizing somebody like me? Yes, you are. Because your adult use market, if you're talking economics, is the largest slice of the pie. The smallest slice of the pie is prescription cannabis, because particularly in Africa, nobody can afford that stuff. Really, we would say yesterday we're speaking about a CBD oil or whatever. You know, you can invest 1,500 Rand for a little bottle of drops of CBD oil. I'd personally rather drink a glass of water, but I like my THC. So cognitive liberty, stigma. We are inadvertently stigmatizing the largest part of the cannabis market while we are also extolling the economic benefits. And as I was saying this morning, and apologies to the people who also attended that one if I'm repeating myself, that one has to somehow stop stigmatizing. You know, we find that the cannabis communities themselves will stigmatize by saying hard and soft drugs. Thank you, the Netherlands. I believe that they introduced that dichotomy. So we find stigma for other drugs within the cannabis community, which is a very, very real challenge for us at Fields of Green for All. And then on the one side, we have the law, which is essentially the evidence. Now, unfortunately, in 2017, when we brought the trial of the plant to the Pretoria High Court, we were filibustered out of court and we ran out of time after 14 days, so that evidence has never been heard. In the Western Cape High Court, the two plaintiffs who sued the government shortly after us in 2011, their case came at the end of 2011, ours came at the beginning, decided that they wanted to exercise their citizens' rights and they didn't take any legal representation, despite this being offered to them pro bono. So their evidence was sorely lacking. And Judge Davis could see that, and that is why Judge Davis called on the likes of Simon to give context to that judgment that he was going to give. So the evidence has never really been heard because all we got was the best and the worst judgment, this whole privacy issue. Then, almost more importantly, on the right-hand side, we have this thing called hearts and minds and perceptions. And we heard from the UNODC that cannabis, the use of cannabis is a real problem, you know? And we heard in the judgment itself that the trade in cannabis is a problem in South Africa. That's why we weren't permitted to trade. So these perceptions go all the way from the man in the street who still sees cannabis as the gateway drug, and dacha is chacha. I don't know if anybody here in this room lived in Yeovil back in the days, in the 80s, and in the Checkers parking lot, it was spray painted across the wall. Dacha is chacha. These perceptions need to be weighed out with the evidence. And the cognitive liberty at the top and the stigma at the bottom gives us right in the middle our 10 crisis points. And this is something that I've been repeating over and over again, and it's a conversation that I even had at Harm Reduction International in Montreal in 2016. Because these crisis points are all enduring. And I won't take too much time with them, but I'll just race through them to give you a little picture of what our world looks like at Fields of Green for All. We have a legislative vacuum. Where is the evidence for the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill? What is the evidence about this plant counting? Why is 15 plants more harmful than 12 plants? And who is going to go to Pondo Land and stand on top of the hill, cross the river, climb the mountain, and go and count those plants? Really? Number two, the ongoing invasion of privacy and autonomy. Well, you don't want to hear the nightmare that goes on in the police holding cells in South Africa. You really, I'm sure a lot of people here, particularly my colleagues from Sisonke, you know what it's like in those police holding cells. And the thing with cannabis is when the accused gets to court on the Monday morning, they invariably throw the case out. And you will never, ever, ever forget the smell on the inside of that holding cell. So we have divorce and custody issues and testing at work and school, and particularly in mining and manufacturing, in people who are doing largely manual labor. They test positive for cannabis in their urine and they lose their job. And that urine test does not test for impairment. That does not. Because if you test positive for THC, you could have had a spliff 2 weeks ago, and you still test positive. And so the most of the incidences that we have of people losing their jobs in this terrible South African economy is the province that is always neglected, that is always left out, that has the most incidents of people losing their jobs for cannabis is the Northern Cape. Why? Because they're busy mining the shit out of the Northern Cape, and everybody in the Northern Cape works in the mines, don't they? So when we see the maps of Africa of South Africa up on the screen, there's Western Cape, there's Gauteng. What about the Rastas in the Northern Cape who grow cannabis on the islands in the middle of the Orange River? Because none of them, because of their religious use of cannabis, none of them can get jobs in the mines. And I promise you, go to Pofadder and ask Aubrey Klutter in Pofadder how many times he's been arrested. It still carries on today. His late wife was actually got a stay of prosecution pending the outcome of our case. So there's lots of forgotten people within these crisis points. The plant counting I've already been through. It's a major bugbear of mine. Number 4, licenses in the Dacha Dompas, because, ladies and gentlemen, the laws against cannabis are the last apartheid law. It was introduced by the apartheid government, and it is still perpetuated by our so-called democratic government. So the scenario is that you prohibit me from using, cultivating and trading in this plant for 100 years. Then you give me a little concession, and you say, but you can come to me and get a piece of paper that will allow you to do this if you've got enough money. So that's why we call it the Dacha Dompas. And that is why licensing of medical cannabis in the rest of Africa is a human rights abuse. Number 5 is this official ignorance. I don't want to even begin to tell you how little the committee that is dealing with the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill in Parliament actually knows about cannabis. These economic benefits, no, cannabis is not going to save the world. Sorry to disappoint you. But you just have to sit on my stoop at the jazz farm outside Johannesburg and you hear story after story of all these big entrepreneurs who've decided now that it's legal, they're going to get into cannabis. Millions and millions and millions have been lost on people trying to set up these huge big facilities, growing cannabis under lights using Eskom that we don't have, okay, using chemicals that really do harm our environment, and then once they've grown the weed, they've got nobody to sell it to because they do not have enough experience to grow cannabis to the EU GMP standards where they actually want to export this cannabis. So what do they do with all that cannabis? They send it out into the streets to be burnt in a series of small fires. Yeah. And what has destroyed our legacy cannabis industry and is continuing to wreak devastation is these licensed facilities not being able to get rid of their tons and tons of weed and actually leaking it out into our dear legacy illicit market. The cannabis industries that speak in vacuums and silos, I can't understand in this very, very important gathering of great minds who really, really get the issues of human rights and harm reduction and all of the issues that we've been discussing. I can't understand that we are the only people from the cannabis industry, Fields of Green for All here. I can't understand all the invitations that I sent out to people to please attend this so that they could understand the bigger picture. Nobody took me up on that invitation. So we have this silo thing, which I think is indicative of a lot of policy making in South Africa, not just cannabis. Industrial cannabis, you know, we know that the 1961 convention says for medicinal and industrial purposes. So now all of a sudden we've got countries like Zimbabwe who suddenly got a hemp industry. I mean, other than for domestic and small-scale use, we do not have an industrial cannabis legacy industry anywhere in Africa. We don't. And now it'll take at least another 20 to 30 years to get this whole new sector of industrial cannabis up and going, but it's being put forward as the savior. Because why? Because it doesn't make you high. There's no political party. We're faced with this dreadful election next year, and it was certainly in our faces at the Phakisa Action Lab, where we were meant to be formulating policy. And I still don't know who to vote for next year, 2024. Who knows? No political party will grow the balls to be able to say, we support cannabis law reform. And then this was something that we actually discussed in quite depth. It was really interesting this morning in our other Cannabis Africana panel, the fact that we're just not telling the youth the truth about cannabis. And if you can just start with the truth and you can start telling that to the youth, then maybe we can start unpicking some of this stigma. And we saw it last night with the UNODC, and I will be outspoken about this. Cannabis does not, there's no scientific evidence to say that cannabis damages the developing brain. That was Henry Anslinger, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. This business about damaging the developing brain, let's forget this now, okay? The head of the cannabis department in President Cyril Ramaphosa's office started smoking cannabis when he was 14. I didn't start smoking cannabis until I was 19. So maybe my brain wasn't so damaged for the 6 years before I was 25 or whatever. So we've got cannabis business, of which there's gazillions of people all over the world merrily conducting cannabis business. And then on the right-hand side, we've got all the things. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, we've got cannabis business, and on the left-hand side, we've got Fields of Green for All. So, never the twain shall meet, ladies and gentlemen. It's very, very difficult for us as a cannabis legalization organization to put forward these really big concepts on the left-hand side in the context of stigma, which is all pervasive, of ignorance on the part of our government, of neo-colonial capture all over the world. Go look at Colombia, go look at Mexico, go look at the great failed Jamaican medical cannabis experiment. Go look at the top-down vertical integration models that were first introduced in California and Colorado. In order to get a license, you had to be able to do everything, from the seed to the bankie. You did everything, so you captured that whole thing. Then we find the terrible, terrible inequality. You go to the Cannabis Expo, which is held here in Cape Town, in Durban, and in Johannesburg, and you see it's all bling, 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 bling all over the place, and everybody's plying their wares, selling a bit of weed under the table, got all of their new gizmos and gadgets, but never a rural farmer to be found in the Cannabis Expo. And then the social injustice. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I was just saying earlier, when I was having a cigarette outside, another drug of choice, that unless the snyman, now I'm not sure if you know what a snyman is, Okay, a Snyman is the guy who sells the matchbox at the BP. Okay, so he's called a Snyman. Unless the Snyman still has the opportunity to put bread on the table, cannabis is not legal. There has to be some way of including the Snyman into this whole scenario. So we've got the drug treaties, we've got the objects and the purposes and the value and the social justice and all of this here, all of this that happens in our cannabis world. And right at the bottom, as the foundation for everything, we have this concept called Dacha private clubs. Cannabis social clubs is what they call them in Spain. And NCOD, which are the great drug NGO in Europe, they first initiated this whole thing of Dacha private clubs. And I've just gone through my 10 awful crisis points, crisis. But, ladies and gentlemen, you can't get what you want unless you know what you want. So that is why we produced this book. And it's called, I think I missed the last slide. Oh, never mind. I'll just tell you about it. It's called Cannabis in South Africa, the People's Plant. A full spectrum, not CBD, a full spectrum guide for policy reform. It's a guiding document. And in here is the system of Dacha private clubs, the system of cooperatives, how to get rid of the police. Take the police and cannabis and separate them completely. Here's an answer to your question, Simon. Separate them completely, and in the middle, put the office of the cannabis ombudsman. And the bud is in capital letters, please. Okay. So the office of the cannabis ombudsman decides whether any harm has been done. So somebody comes, steals your weed, you go to the cannabis ombudsman and they say, that's criminal, you can't steal something like that. So you get reported to the police. But we have to have some sort of barrier between us and the police. In order to protect our privacy, we've got the Dacha private clubs and lots more concepts in here. This is available for a free download on our website, and we really are battling to have this heard. It's not difficult reading. It's just a guiding document for the government, but to date, they're not reading it. And if anybody's got any suggestions on how I can get them to read it and look at these very, very simple concepts in here, I really am open to suggestion. Another thing which seems to be a theme of Drug Policy Week is this whole idea of resources. It's incredibly difficult to keep going as a completely non-resourced NGO in South Africa. People see cannabis as a done deal. People see cannabis as something that's just easy to do. It seems that needle exchange programs and that type of thing, while not less important, are much more politically correct to support. So here's another request. If anybody has any idea how I can get hold of some money, then please let me know. Thank you very much.